start recording things. Now, just to give a chance to get appreciation for who we're going to be talking to, you've seen on the original introduction. Mark got a permaculture design certificate from OSU and a master gardener's certificate through Humboldt State. And he's also completed the intensive agriculture course at OSU. And this last year, he was one of the original organizers of the Wild Rivers Permaculture Guild and has done a bunch of work here in Curry County as well as Del Norte and around. Now, aside from being a master gardener and such, he's also got a master's of science degree in applied physics from the Naval Postgraduate School, spent most of his professional career flying airplanes like F-18s for the Navy and MD-11s for FedEx. So he's a Renaissance man because he also owns the bookstore in town. So with that intro, let me turn it over to you, Mark. Why don't you share your screen?
Well, how do I do that?
If down at the bottom, you should be able to hit the share screen.
Oh, yeah.
Bottom. Get that.
Share.
And everybody sees his laundry.
Okay, we should be in presentation mode now.
You're all set. And we're recording.
So we're going to go through the concepts of permaculture at a very high level. Each of these topics can take as long as a week to go through and discuss. We're going to hit a high level on the basics of permaculture. What is permaculture? It's kind of an old way of growing food combined with some newer techniques. So if you think back thousands of years, there was no farm equipment, there was no pesticides, there were no insecticides, there were no fungicides. So it was a way of integrating things such that things grew properly and you could obtain food to eat. So Bill Mollison is a guy from Australia, and Holgram is another guy from Australia. They kind of put these concepts together. I wouldn't say they invented permaculture because most of the techniques in permaculture are very old and have been around forever, but they did put it together in one concise thought process. And that really is what permaculture is. It's a way of thinking about how to do things with a set of principles and ethics that guide you along the way. So I'll let you read the different definitions. This is Bill Mollison's original. The next one is from David Holgram. It all talks about utilizing systems, mimicking natural systems to produce an abundance of wonderful tasting food and collecting energy to do that without wasting things. And I like this guy, the Gestalt Gardner, doing stuff that makes sense, which if you follow along with permaculture, a lot of it does make sense once you start thinking about it. So here's a kind of busy slide, and we're going to go through each of these. At the center of permaculture is the three ethics, which are care for the earth, fair share, and care for the people, in whatever order you want it. And then around that are all the different principles, which we'll go through shortly. So the three ethics, care for the earth, that's basically just treating the earth as if it's special and try to working with it cooperatively instead of tearing it apart or abusing it to get whatever you want out of it. Care for the people, that's pretty obvious when you think about it. It goes from your family level to the community level to the global community, and trying to get the earth to cooperate better with human beings such that there's a longevity in mind for future generations and not just destroying the earth for whatever purpose we want it to give back to us. And fair share is all about producing an abundance of edible and sustainable crops and then sharing with everybody and enjoying it. Any questions as we get started? We're going to go into the principles here shortly.
Haven't seen anything come up on chat. One question, I think you've already touched on it, in that the tie-in between permaculture and climate change.
So Bill, you could probably answer that one better than I could.
Well, just as what you had said, just the caring for the planet and not going in excess and getting good use of the resources, not wasting things. All of that ties in so effectively to climate change. So, which is the reason why this talk and this whole area is so critically important to sort of reevaluating how we're dealing with nature. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you'll see as we go through it, it's about eliminating waste, or not eliminating waste, using things that appear to be waste in a way that's productive.
Yeah.
The other one thing I wanted to mention is that a lot of times when you start talking about permaculture to some of the original, it becomes almost cultish. And recently, the permaculture people who call themselves permies have tried to get away from that. It's really about growing food. It's not a religious thing. It's not a cultish thing. It's a better way to grow food. And one thing I like about permaculture the most is that the food actually does taste better. It's absolutely delicious. When you grow things in a proper environment and allow it to grow at its finest, it tastes better. Okay, now we're going to the permaculture principles. There are 12 of them. Actually, in certain areas, you'll see 18 or 15. I went with the original 12. So the first thing is to observe and interact. So anytime you go onto a property, the first thing you should do is sit back and observe for a while before you start making changes. Now, that's not to say if you want to plant a tree to not do anything until you observe for a year or two. Just do it incrementally as you learn more and more about whatever property you're working on. So this was a property I worked on for a number of years. I own the land. And this was a larger property. It was 13 acres. So there was a lot to learn about the property before you make any major changes, such as changing the slope, changing the water flow, or anything like that. However, the first thing I did was put in 8 apple trees because I wanted to. So some of the things that you want to observe on any property, and this is a way of depicting some of that, but the winter sun, where does, on summer solstice, where's the sun rising and setting? At the equinoxes, where's the sun rising and setting? So you can get a pattern of where the sun passes over the top all year round, so that you can predict what's going to be good sunspots, what's going to be good shade spots. Wildlife corridors. Do you have wildlife that passes through your property? And what can you do to either enhance it or direct them in a way that they're not detrimental to the property? On the property I'm talking about right now, there were elk everywhere. And we had to put up enough fencing to control them so they didn't eat everything, because they were capable of eating just about everything. Knowing where your neighbors are, knowing where the fire hazards are. For this particular property, there was a problem with downwind, downhill from it, were the lily farms. And I don't know if you've been around the lily farms much, but the lily farms spray about 9 times a year to kill everything except the lilies. Well, that might be good for lily growing, but it's not good for anything else. And the winds actually blow the residue uphill, and there was some mild deposits of that on the property. Also knowing where the prevailing winds are. There's a whole bunch of things that you can observe, take notes on, and utilize that information as you're planning. Here's this is kind of an exhaustive example of the things you can and should observe. And again, it's not meant to prevent you from moving ahead. It's meant to prevent you from making major mistakes that you would have to be corrected in order to grow things properly. Second principle is to catch and store energy. Why? Because we would prefer not to burn hydrocarbons when we don't have to. Now, that's not to say you're never going to burn a hydrocarbon if you're doing a farm. one of the concepts of permaculture is that, well, I'll give you a personal one. We were working on a property that there were blackberry vines everywhere. And if you didn't use some kind of machinery to get rid of them, by the time you cut all of them down, the first ones that you had cut had already regrown completely, and you would never get the job done. So utilizing machinery at the appropriate time, at the appropriate level is absolutely acceptable. Here's some examples of catch and store energy. One is rain barrels, which actually has the ability to spread the water via gravity, so you don't have to have any kind of pumping system. A sun trap is an interesting concept so that you can actually raise plants that require a higher temperature than what is average in your area by planting a backstop such that the sun hits. Oh, hold on just a second, turn this off. Sorry about that. But so this is a technique that allows you to grow things that would not normally grow in the area or wouldn't fruit properly. I got an example of a guy that lives here in Brookings that he planted an orange tree, which oranges normally don't ripen. They'll bear a little bit of fruit, but they don't get all the way to being ripe. But he planted it right next to his house. The color of the house is blue. So during the summer, the blue radiated the heat back onto the plant, and the side of the orange tree that was next to the house had all these beautiful ripe oranges, and the side away from the house had a couple and not quite as many. So anyway, that's the concept of a sun trap. A wind trap is actually meant to minimize the wind. So if you got prevailing winds coming from a certain direction and it ends up blowing different crops, that will cut the tops off of them. There's a number of different techniques to prevent the wind from doing such destructive damage. And this is one of the examples of a hedge where the hedge actually causes the wind to go up above it. So anyway, this is just an example. You can take a look at that a little bit later. Another one is a greenhouse and a pond where the winter sun reflects off the pond, hits the greenhouse, and causes the greenhouse to be warmer than it normally would be. A cold frame is a very simple construction where you allow sun to come in, warm up the ground. You open it up to allow the sunlight to get in during the daytime, or in the summer you take the glass doors off of it. These are all techniques that can be used to enhance growing techniques in a given environment. Any questions?
Don't have any specific questions that I want to address now. There's some general ones that I'm going to save those till the end. So why don't we keep going to the next one?
Okay. So my favorite part of permaculture is obtaining a yield. So this is back on that farm. This is a design that we created where we utilize the slopes and utilize what's known as the zones. We'll get to the zones here shortly in permaculture, where you grow things that you're going to use every day closest to wherever you're going to be cooking or living. And then as you get further and further away, you get further out into orchards and remote areas. This was a design where we actually terraced the land a little bit, put in some greenhouses, then developed orchards as we went down the hill with using plant guilds along the way such that the plants actually grow together and help each other. We'll get to that concept here shortly. So this is a typical, or one idea of a plant guild. If you think about what most farms in the US do, they plant 1,000 Gala apple trees, and that's all they grow. Or they plant thousands of acres of corn. Well, that's not the way the natural environment works. You go to a forest, you get lots of different kinds of trees, you get smaller plants, you get all these different things growing together, and they support each other. If you get into a field with 1,000 of one type of apple and you get a disease that attacks one tree, it's going to attack every tree. So the solution to that is to spray all kinds of different chemicals on it to prevent the one disease or the one pest to get in and destroy the entire crop. If, on the other hand, you grow two apple trees with a bunch of stuff to support it around it, including nitrogen fixers, which help you eliminate some of the fertilizer you need, plants to attract bugs so that the fruit gets pollinated. You treat the underlying soil with mycelium to allow the roots of the trees to be healthy. And then you utilize all kinds of different plants around it, both vertically and area-wise. You get a more healthy environment. So this is an idea of a plant guild, and this is one of the biggest concepts to get from permaculture, is that when you plant a single plant, think about what can go around it, both vertically and next to it sideways, and then look into what plants are going to be symbiotic with each other. So this is in a vertical view of the same concept. If you think about layering vertically and how the sun's going to hit each of the vertical aspects of your plant guild, you can grow an awful lot more crop in a single space than one would think about. So this is a typical what a permaculture residence, it's a edible landscape, or a food garden is what they would also call it. And this is how thick you can plant things that are all growing either crops that produce flowers to attract different insects or growing food. So another one of the principles is that accept self-regulation or apply self-regulation and accept feedback. So we got some examples of it. One of the properties I was working on is another 13-acre project on the south bank of the Windchuck. And when we were doing our observations, we came across an old orchard in a floodplain. And it floods in that area about every 3 or 4 years. And it was not an area where I would have ever thought to put an orchard in, but the small orchard had been there for 20 years unkept. No one had touched it. All the trees were doing fine except where the bears were tearing them apart, and everything was growing fruit. So I had to reassess and go, maybe this is a good place for an orchard, because we did a little bit of maintenance on it and it was fine within a couple of years. Another example is, so this is, once you've done most of your observations, you start actually doing things, and then you learn from what happens. If you put in a pond, it doesn't hold water, oh, there should be another way of helping that. A plastic sheet or bayrite, which is used to seal porosity problems. And then what most of us that live around here have, unless you're right in the middle of the town, deer and elk eat everything. So what are the different ways to work with deer and elk? Well, utilize fencing to guide them, but also plant things that they like to eat to keep them out of the stuff you don't want them to eat. Any questions?
You're doing a good job of keeping everybody entertained and educated, or as, no, I won't say it. So why don't we keep going?
Okay. Using value renewable resources and services. So this is probably the one that ties most directly to climate change. So if you think about functional analysis of a chicken, and you can take this slide and look at it in more detail. It's actually kind of humorous in certain ways, but if you looked at everything, what are the products that you can get from a chicken, and what does it need in order for the chicken to produce those products? So obviously you think of eggs and meat, but you could also use the feathers, the manure. Scratching is used in that. When you use chickens in a permaculture environment or in a garden, they scratch the ground and they actually aerate the soil and eat a lot of the bad bugs. So chickens have lots of different areas that work well in a garden environment. What do they need in order to do what they do best? They need shelter, they need air, they need water, they need food, they need other chickens. So if you start doing an analysis of everything in your garden at that level, whatever is interesting to you, you can learn things and how they interact better. We can use solar power for drying clothes. That's been around for a long time. Water wheels is another example of utilizing energy sources. Most of California for sure looks down upon changing waterways, but I don't, I'm hoping that at some point they'll start rethinking that, because having water just rush off your property is the worst thing you can do for the environment. Instead of letting it meander on the property, sink into the soil, utilize it to grow things, it's going to get to wherever it's going to go eventually. It'll just get there slower. Windmill is another example of them utilizing energy. Next one is produce no waste. And if you think, again, let's kind of start off with this. Instead of thinking of things as waste, you think of them as potential, what are the potential uses for it? So a compost pile, I don't know how many people have composted, but it's an absolutely wonderful way of creating high quality soil and to grow things in. So you take your waste, limited to a few things that shouldn't go in a compost pile. I won't go into a compost lecture today. And you get these wonderful soils that grow things amazingly. One of the things that we're utilizing out here is some of the seaweed off the beach and leftovers from clippings and leftovers from preparing a meal. And it all goes into the compost pile and you turn it, and after, depending on how much the ratio you have and how hot it gets, it takes anywhere from 3 to 6 months, and you've got just wonderful soil that you don't have to buy from the local hardware store or Fred Meyer's. So this is, so Living Machine is one of my favorites. If you think about how things grow, there's a hierarchy in the world of food. Something eats something, it produces a waste product, something else eats that waste product. And you can go from the highest, like a shark or a tiger or a human, and figure out what happens all the way down the food chain to the smallest bacteria, which is cleaning out waste. For instance, oysters and mollusks do a wonderful job of cleaning up waste from other systems. So does algae and different grasses. So if you think of a polyculture type environment where you're raising fish, you feed the fish pellets, they excrete certain things. You can utilize shrimp to eat that. The waste of the shrimp feed different seaweeds or dulse products. And you go all the way down the food chain where you actually end up with clean water to start the whole system over again. And that's the concept of a living machine. So for a thought experiment, if say you've got 10 trees, before you go prune those 10 trees, what are you going to do with the clippings? Most people just pile them up and throw them away. Well, if they're apple trees or any kind of fruit tree, you certainly can use it to smoke different fish products or any kind of product that you like smoked. You can use it in a compost pile. You can use it as a windbreak by piling it up and using it on the edges of your property as a hedge. So anytime you start to do a project, it's really, think about what are you going to do with what's left over after you've done that. So we just one of my trees out here, the apples are already ripe, and we pressed them, and all of the leftover. So we had one guy wanted to try to do fritters with it, and one person wants to try and ferment it, and some of it else is going to go into a compost pile, but none of it just went into the garbage. Back to the questions.
So we have a question from a little bit earlier, but it does kind of fit in.
Okay.
The question had to do with what is hugelkultur?
Oh, hugelkulture. So that's a hugelkulture is a technique for improving the soil and for growing things long term without ever having to fertilize. So what you do is you normally you'll use a deciduous tree, hardwood tree, maple, alder. You're gonna dig a trench. You're gonna normally if a tree falls down, for instance, you cut it up into log-sized pieces. You put them aside. You let them cure for 6 to 8 months so that the natural protective system of the tree goes away, and mycelium starts to get in there to the mushrooms will actually process the wood and turn it to rot. So after about 6 months, when everything its natural processes are over with, or its natural healing stuff is gone, you dig a trench, put the logs at the bottom of the trench, cover it with any kind of grass or any other kind of greens, cover it back up with the soil. Over time, the logs will rot. It'll improve the overall consistency and quality of the soil. And as it does that, it makes fertilizer for the plants that you grow on top of it. So it looks like a small levee with plants growing from the sides to the top. You also increase the surface area upon which you can plant things. So I don't know if I have a good picture of a hugelkulture in this brief, but that's the whole concept of hugelkulture. That makes sense?
Yeah, well, it does to me, but I helped put one in.
You help dig one.
It's really good to get a whole bunch of people helping out. That was probably the best take-home lesson on that hugelkulture effort.
Or I would use a tractor.
Yeah. So one of the people I asked about grass clipping is you mentioned that you put the log in and then adding things for greens. And how does grass clippings, how do they sort of fit into the overall recycling thing?
Yeah, so grass clippings are wonderful in a compost pile. They also can be used, I use them around the bases of small trees. After they've been planted, you circle them with cardboard to keep grass from growing back up and competing with whatever plant you did. You cover that with grass clippings. They slowly decay and turn into fertilizer and feed the tree. So grass clippings are a wonderful thing for turning into fertilizer or soil. And then again, either utilizing it in the compost pile or using it around the edges of plants.
And let me
as a mulch, actually, it can form as a mulch.
Yeah. Let me add or sort of pick your brain on one thing with respect to if you've got lots and lots of grass clippings, which suggests you've got lots and lots of grass in a lawn.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe you should think about changing that. Because, okay, so just a discussion on lawns. Lawns are one of the most wasted use of human energy and electricity and water that the human beings have ever created. I guess they're appealing to most people, but you use a lot of energy to keep cutting them, and then you fertilize it, and then you spray it with water to keep grasses growing that shouldn't be growing in this environment. And then you pay a lot of money to do that, and you can't eat it. So if you just think about converting at least parts of your lawn into a plant guild that's growing fruit and vegetables, and it takes less energy and you get to eat it. Anyway, that's my thoughts on lawns.
Which I think is good. Slowly moving forward to that, not liking to mow grass either. So
and again, you're utilizing, well, maybe someone has the old style lawnmower. But not many people do. You're either using electricity or gasoline to cut your lawn.
Yeah. Now there are some other questions about good references and overall things, but I'm going to save those towards the end.
Okay.
One of the things, because we just talked about compost, the question was, how do you keep rodents and cats out of the compost?
You can put screens around it. Now, at some level, you're not going to keep all the rodents out of it, but generally speaking, if you've got your compost going correctly, it's going to be too hot for them to bother with. The compost will get up to 120, 140 degrees when
Wow.
it's doing its thing properly, and the rodents don't like that.
Clearly, we got a topic of another talk. So we'll save that till later. Why don't I let you keep moving on then?
Okay. Now, if you let your compost go crazy where you're just throwing your food on top of it, which you're not supposed to do, the rodents will come. I had a renter that was doing that, and yes, we had mice and rats everywhere. Okay, design from patterns to details. And again, this all goes back to the observations and observing things before you start putting in big ideas. So we talked a little bit about the zone. So in permaculture, we talk about zones 1 through 5, and each one successfully gets you further and further away from your place of living and is less frequently visited. And for most homes, you only have like zone 1, 2, and 3. You really don't have a 4 and a 5. Zone 1 is where you're going to be growing your herbs, maybe cherry tomatoes, which you're going to pick daily and bring into the kitchen. Zone 2, it will be some plant guilds that you're going to visit on the order of once a day. Zone 3 is going to be if you had an orchard where you go out there maybe weekly, maybe more often during harvest season. Zone 4 is the remote locations on the property where you're maybe growing mushrooms off of logs. And zone 5 is really the wild part of the property that is rarely visited, and that's where the wildlife gets to hang out. So that's the concept of zones. And we utilize those zones based to design what your permaculture site's going to look like. This is more details of the different zones. I'll give you a couple minutes to look over it. And again, most residential places never get beyond, they don't have a zone 5. But if you do have a big enough property, it's important to have a zone 5 if you can, because that allows the wildlife to have a place where they're safe. And wildlife is just as important to your permaculture site as is anything else. If you think about birds and bees and butterflies, all those things help pollinate, help control pests from getting too active, too many. So developing the balance of the wild and the cultivated is an important technique for developing a site that takes less and less energy input to get a yield off of it. Okay, moving on. So not only do we talk about zones, we also talk about sectors. And a sector would be something that's unique, different as you go around the 360-degree view of whatever property you're on. So that on that one hillside, the hillside was very, very different from the very dense forest off to the north, whereas the hillside was open to the sun. And one of the ideal places for planting things is we got maximum sun on there. You could also utilize the forest for doing crops like wasabi, which require intense shade. So this is just another technique of mapping out where your sectors are and how your property changes on a 360-degree view of it. Again, knowing how your property slopes, for one thing, that's where you're going to utilize gravity to help with water distribution across the property. Knowing where so one of the concepts, and this is, I'm not going to go into too much detail, in permaculture, it's called a key line. A key line is the point on the property where the slope slows down and becomes almost flat. That's where that part of the property is. They call it the key line because that's how you can control the water flow against over the rest of the property below that key line. So the next concept is to integrate rather than segregate. So again, I'm kind of talking a lot about a plant guild because it's one of the more important concepts that if you can get anything out of this brief is that when you look at planting something that's going to grow food, figure out what else you can plant around it to maximize that space and the health of the garden. So you'll do a vertical integration plus a side-to-side integration and a forward-to-back integration. So in this particular one, we were doing fig trees and lemon trees. In the back of that, we had rhododendrons and azaleas for attracting different types of bugs. We were putting in different layers of berries, strawberries for the ground cover, moving up to blueberries and honeyberries. We also had inoculated logs for oyster mushrooms and shiitake, bordering the plant guild. Obviously, this is a young guild. It had just been planted. But if you start thinking about how else, what can I get in that space that's going to take the place of weeds and grass? So you've got nitrogen fixers, a gomi berry is a nitrogen fixer, comfrey is a nitrogen fixer, and a nitrogen fixer just works with the insects of the mycelium to lock in nitrogen so that you don't have to use as much fertilizer. So this is another way of looking at a plant guild. You've got vertical spacing and you've got horizontal spacing. And as long as the plants are chosen correctly based on their sunlight needs, you can prune the plants to keep them in a way that they're all going to get the proper sunlight in order to produce the best fruit or vegetables or flowers if you're just trying to attract either just making it beautiful or trying to attract different insects. Oh, and then with this one, I've got a plug for a book that's one of the best I've read in a long time. It's called Roots Demystified, and it takes that picture there and brings you down into the soil to figure out how to space things more properly, because roots don't grow the way they're taught to grow in most any master gardener course that I've taken, or even in the permaculture. Everyone tells you one thing about roots that just isn't correct. It is not the reverse of the canopy of the thing that's growing. So we talked about this a little bit, but if you think about the problems with our current modern forming techniques of growing a monoculture, you have to control everything that could possibly wipe out your crop. And the crop itself is defenseless except for its own defenses that occur naturally. When you talk about a polyculture, you're planting flowers to attract insects that'll eat other insects that are bad. You're using mycelium or mushroom culture to be symbiotic with the different plants to increase their ability to absorb nutrition and moisture from the soil. You're putting in bird houses so the birds can help protect the different crops and prevent insects from becoming too much of a pest. You're controlling patterns of the deer and the elk in order so that they don't eat everything. It's a very symbiotic relationship with all the different things that you plant, instead of the common method of planting one crop, spraying for everything to keep anything from killing it and destroying your financial gains for the year. Anyway, so that's kind of the idea of a monoculture and a polyculture. Permaculture fully supports polyculture. Questions?
Got a number of interesting questions. I think one of them was the best way to handle weeds, but I think you kind of touched on that, but I'll let you expand a bit.
Yeah, so some of the weeds, just let them grow. If they become too intrusive, permaculture utilizes either cardboard or other coverings to kill, by covering it and preventing whatever the weeds are from getting sunlight, they die. And the cardboard disintegrates and becomes fertilizer. You can also use compost and wood chips to cover the ground to keep the weeds out. So there's a number of different techniques, and then there's always, you do have to end up pulling some of them yourself. But generally it's to plant things close enough so that the things you want to grow are utilizing the soil and the moisture as much as it can. Utilizing compost and different coverings to prevent other, to help keep down the different weeds. Utilizing cardboard or cardboard type substances. And just a plug for not using the netting or the gardener's cloths, because that not only prevents the weeds from growing, it also prevents the soil from being improved over time. So when you do the additives, you actually should pull up, if you do some kind of fertilizer, you should pull up the gardener's cloth so that the fertilizer gets to where it needs to be. But that also means that the leaves that are disintegrating and turning into fertilizer aren't getting to the crops properly.
Yeah,
Is that a good enough answer on the weeds?
I think so. It's funny because we've started using the cardboard, and it's been amazingly effective. And like you said, it's really nice because you feel like it's not just the plastic sitting there, it's going to decompose and it's giving something back, as well as being really good at controlling weeds.
Yeah, and if you use a cardboard with some kind of mulch on top of it, it really works wonderful.
Yeah.
And it actually looks good because if you use wood chips, right, they kind of look good on top.
Yeah. And we just got a cheap $100 wood chipper and have gotten bags and bags and bags of wood chips just from having to trim the hedge and things like that. So
yeah, and again, so that's another thing where you got a hint, trim the hedges. What am I going to do with this? Well, if I chip it, I can use it for ground cover and mulch.
Yeah.
Instead of throw it in a garbage can and haul it off to the dump.
Right. Now, there are a couple of people who are asking about either gophers or dealing with the ground squirrels who try to eat everything.
If you saw my yard, you would figure out that I'm not an expert at that. Trapping them is really the best way. There are sound devices that I've heard are pretty good, but the only thing I know that works is actually once you get an infestation of voles or gophers, it's to trap them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the challenge.
Yes.
So, yeah.
The sound things might be interesting because they certainly don't do any harm to anything else that I know of.
Yeah. Also, somebody had asked about problem with glues in the production of the cardboard.
Yeah, so the advice on cardboard is that all of the plastic, the tape needs to come off. To the greatest extent possible, get something with very little writing or color on it. So just a plain brown cardboard. Yeah, the glues. So one of the things I try to, because I own the bookstore, we have excess books at times, books that need to just go away. I tried to do mulch with it, and by the time you take the cover off, because it possibly has metals in it, and you cut off the spine because it's got glue that probably came from China, it just wasn't worth it. So that one, if anybody's got an idea how to utilize books that are no longer proper for reading, send me an idea. So I've been trying to figure that one out for 3 or 4 years. But yes, glues you do not want as little as possible, and you don't want the plastic or the whatever kind of tape is on it.
What about egg cartons? We seem to go through a lot of eggs, and the egg carton.
Yeah, they're good. Most of that is fine. That is actually designed to be recycled very easily. You chop that up and use it as mulch, or just use it as the way it is. Now, if they have the sticker on it with the glue, maybe want to try and get that off.
Yeah. Yeah. And then from the standpoint of a number of the restaurants will be having compostable cups and takeout containers. Does that work well in these kinds of compost?
I don't know that much about that.
Yeah.
One of the issues there is what's been in the container. So that one I would defer to. I have to do some research on that one.
Yeah. Well, the last one before I let you keep going is somebody had asked, what are honeyberries?
Oh, that's honeyberries are delicious. They actually grow really well here. Rain Tree Nursery has them most of the time, although I'm not saying Rain Tree has anything these days, but
Yeah.
they normally have them. And they're an oblong, almost looks like a date, except it's a fresh berry. They get these kind of little ripples on it, and they're really sweet and got a little bit of a grape-like taste to them, maybe. But yeah, they grow really well in this area. And I forget the origin right now. It's not coming to me.
Well, without having a pitch to Rain Tree, maybe you could mention a little bit. We've, through discussions with you and others, found out that Rain Tree's a hell of a good place for things that we've never heard of, but they're.
Yeah, and what they do is they specialize in marine climate plants. So specific to the Pacific Northwest. They'll have other things also, but on their website, they will tell you whether the plant that you're purchasing, what climate it should be planted in, what it does best in. And so they, I don't know, a number of years ago, there was an emphasis on looking at so if we're in the Northern Hemisphere, look at equivalent places by latitude in the Southern Hemisphere, you'll find plants that will probably grow in your area. So there are quite a few plant companies that did that, and a lot of this stuff comes from South America or equivalent latitudes in the Southern Hemisphere.
Well, I was surprised when you had mentioned kiwi, and so we've planted some kiwi. Hopefully, we can make them grow.
Yeah, kiwi do extremely well there. I've seen kiwi plants that were 30 feet and 8 feet high. Now they probably should have been pruned a little bit over time. And I know one person, she'll get 500 kiwis on one plant.
Oh, wow. It's pretty good. Well, I'll let
kiwis, you need a male and a female.
Yeah,
that's right. So yeah, we've got a boy and a girl growing on our fence. Hopefully it'll work. So, well, let me keep you going.
Okay. Okay, next permaculture principle is use small and slow solutions. And we got a few examples of that. So this is more just testing out your ideas before you make a massive investment in anything. So if you're gonna catch water, put a couple of buckets out there and see how much water you're gonna get. I mean, you can also calculate it based on whatever roof size and annual rainfall, but set up something practical and just test it out before you spend a bunch of money and figure out that what you thought was there wasn't. Start with a simple compost pile before going broader and bigger. Make sure you understand how it all works. So soil testing, so some things in soil testing, I am a firm believer in doing percolation rates and getting an idea of the quality of the soil. One of them that I'm not that big a fan of is doing pH testing, unless you're just trying to learn what it is, because you're not going to be able to change the pH of the soil except in a very local area. And the rest of most of the soil testing you can do yourself. pH testing or quality, doing the different composition down to potassium and the different minerals, that's expensive. You have to send that off. I prefer just to manipulate the soil, put some things in, see what grows well, ask neighbors what grows well, get the advice of Rain Tree Nursery, and just go for it. Oh, and here's an example of, so if you're on a property where in most properties, you're gonna wanna control the water flow, the more you slow it down, the more it sinks into the soil, the less watering you're gonna have to do and the better utilization of water, natural water, the rainfall that you're going to be able to produce. So if you start off with small swales, just to see how that, so example is if you have sheeting where when it rains, you've got one area of your lawn where the water just flows across it. Put in a couple of small levees or swales as they're called and see what that does. See if it slows it down. See if before you do anything major. Because once you've done a major project, if it doesn't work, you kind of got to start all over with. It gets expensive. Okay. Use and value diversity. And this is, again, this is polyculture. But it's also for an example of this is grow different. Don't set up your garden such that everything comes ripe at the same time. Because then you've got way too much food. And likely your neighbors, if they're growing stuff, they're all going to be producing. So try to select plants that become mature and ripe. The fruit ripens at different times throughout the year. And you can look at different apples. I wish I knew the name of the apple tree I have, because it's already ripe. It's just about done. And the two other apple trees I have won't be ripe until October, November. So you can spread out, you can do, they also have blueberries. They've got the early, late spring, early summer ripening ones, and you get all the way out to November blueberries. So if you stagger when things ripen, you can spread out the crops that you're able to eat and utilize fresh. If you have the opportunity that you are raising animals for meat or other products, get a diverse set of them. Even with chickens, don't have everyone the same kind of chicken. Again, if one of them gets sick, they're probably all going to get sick. Okay, so here's a plug for a book. It's one of my favorites. Tomatoes Love Carrots. That's the name of the book. The woman that wrote it originally is just awesome. She passed away a number of years ago. But it talks about companion planting, and that's one of her favorites, is that tomatoes and carrots should be planted together. And she goes into, and it's not overly detailed, it just gives you a synopsis of what things should be planted together and why. Oh, mix in things that aren't just food. Lots of permaculturists will tell you we should be just growing fruit. That's not true. That's not how a system works best. Grow things for the way they look. Whatever motivates you to continue to go outside and do the work. If it's flowers, if it's fruit, if it's vegetables, if it's just some of the prettier plants. So utilize non-food guild associates with your food crops. And then beat this one more time. Insects, fungus, and wild animals. Learn the interactions. Learn what they do positive as well as the negative. And there's a whole other topic of fungus. Paul Stamets' website, Fungi Perfecti, is a wonderful site for starting to learn a little bit about the capabilities of what we can do with funguses in landscapes and growing crops, and how much the mycelium interacts with the root systems to produce things that grow much more quickly and produce better products. Questions?
One was having to do Rain Tree Nursery local, or is it online? And I mentioned it's online, and we can provide the information, the address, if anybody's interested.
Yeah, they're in Southern Washington State. And I went up there in the middle of winter thinking it'd be awesome, and there was nobody around hardly. I thought I was going to get a tour of the gardens. No, that wasn't happening. So. I think it's best just ordering from them instead of going visiting.
Yeah. Well, like you
But they
said,
do have a very good website, and they do produce a quarterly catalog, which is very good also.
yeah. And they are in quite demand. Vicky had ordered stuff, and it took how many weeks to get here? It was considerably longer than we'd anticipated, but which is sort of a victim of their own success. It's going well.
And a pandemic.
That added to it. Everything comes back to COVID.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'll let you continue.
Okay, using edge and value the marginal. So most of the time when you evaluate a property, you look right at the biggest, flattest part of the land, and that's what you're going to grow on. Well, that's not always the best way to treat a property. So if you think about edges and even creating edges and what happens along the edges, there's wonderful ways of growing things. And this is just kind of an exaggerated example of what can be done on edges. It's a pretty picture. This is a simple concept of, instead of digging a round pond, you can do some kind of star shape and dramatically increase the edge of the pond for growing things or planting things. A keyhole garden is another example of, and this is normally combined with a sun trap or a wind trap, where you carve out areas such that the wind or the sun gets in there, and you create more edges, and along the edges you're planting lots of different variety of crops. And then my favorite example is, what do you do? So normally in this area, if you are going to do a fairly large garden design, you need to figure out your water source and your fencing. Because again, I saw 4 buck deer walking down Main Street in Brookings yesterday, and they're capable of eating a lot. So if you think about your fencing area, what can you do along the fence? Vines grow wonderfully along a fence. We actually took one project that had a really steep hill, and we needed a fence at the top of it. So we actually did hops. We grew hops up along the edge of the ground, which were easy to harvest, and it utilized an area that we were struggling to figure out what we could do with. But if you look at this picture, a fence is not just to keep something out or in, it's also to grow things along. And then the final one is creatively use and respond to change. At the level at which we're talking, we can't control the climate. We can accept it and grow things, hopefully on a larger scale. We can do things to prevent the climate from continuing the direction it is. But for the most part, at our level, we need to adjust to climate as it does change, whether that be man-made or if an earthquake happens, that's going to change things a lot. So think of examples that you can utilize to take advantage of things that do change. Unreliable rainfall, use water catchment and storage systems. If the winters are getting colder, adjust to treat crops that require longer chill hours. A chill hour is a defined hour where the temperature is below 40 degrees. So most of your stone fruits, meaning peaches, plums, and some apples, require a certain amount of chill hours in order for it to produce flowers and bear fruit. In this area, we get maybe 300 chill hours a year. You've got some plants that require 800 chill hours, so you wouldn't want to plant an 800 chill hour plant in this environment. It's never going to produce fruit. As the summers get hotter, what else can we do with tree crops or semi-shade in a garden? If the world throws a pandemic at you, take the time to plant a garden. Compacted soils or poor soils, or even with your rodent problem, the possibility of controlling that with raised beds with some kind of wire filament at the bottom of it to keep the rodents out. So those are just some examples of how to adjust to things as they change. And here's a list of the slot where the slides came from. Bill, any other questions? That's kind of the end of the presentation for today.
I think that it's been well regarded. Had one question. We do have the raised beds, and sort of the pitch for we took out our old deck and used the decking to help rebuild the next one, but also use that wood to make a raised bed. And we got rid of the dealing with the rodents, but the snails and the slugs don't have any problem with climbing up and doing that. Any suggestions on dealing with snails and slugs?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of old tricks. One of them is take the saucepan out and pour beer in it.
We've got drunk slugs now. Yeah, that's.
But the newest one is the chaff off of roasted coffee beans.
Oh.
You use that underneath as a mulch or around the edges, and it might work with coffee grounds, I would think. I'm not positive, but that'd be something to try, because coffee grounds are perfectly good in a compost pile or just adding to your soil. Try that and see if that. I did read an article that said the chaff of the coffee bean is awesome to prevent slugs and snails. They don't like it at all.
Huh. Well, they're
So
like
try the coffee grounds. Let me know.
Since we don't like coffee, and we're in the very vast minority, we'll have to have somebody else that tries it. Let us know. So Gloria suggests spread diatomaceous earth or shallow pans of beer. You got that one. So yeah. All right. Just a reminder that this is recorded, so that if you're interested in going back, and if you can't write all these things down very quickly, you can always go pick it up off the net. We should have it certainly on the SOCAN Facebook page and SOCAN website, and possibly we'll do the link to the Coastal SOCAN Facebook and our website web page on SOCAN. Let me remind you, because there was a question, how do we do it and do this stuff on small scale, sort of raised beds and doing it on little backyard things. Next Tuesday, we were coordinating between Mark's talk and the talk next week on small scale permaculture and agriculture. And that's going to be live streaming, Facebook streaming at at SOCAN's Facebook page. So I sent that out when I sent the reminder to people. So if you're interested in that, you'll have a chance to take what Mark gave as the overview, and then look at the details of the sorts that y'all might be interested in. So I was curious if anybody else has any other questions. Marina had a suggestion about building a pond and putting the veggies on a table in the pond, like use it as a moat. Get mosquito fish for the pond. Any ideas? Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Well, speaking for myself, and my experience is that if nobody else shows up or speaks up, then I'm assuming that they're either asleep. Having been a teacher, I know that's a possibility. But this is really entertaining and interesting. So thank you very much, Mark. This has been exactly what I was hoping for to present to everybody. So
thank you, Mark. Nice job.
Thanks.
Now with that, I know that Dennis, you're a master gardener as well, right?
Yes. Thank you.
There any other thoughts about where to go from here, or Mark? Because I guess you both went through the OSU Master Gardener program. Is that right?
Right. No, I just cringed when he said, "Don't check your soil. Don't analyze your soil," because that's one thing that they drill into us during the training. Knowing exactly what your soil and everything. But I tend to agree. I mean, it depends on what you're doing and what type of project you have. We know that we have an acidic soil here, and generally, which works great for pine trees and conifers. But I mean, I've done fine without really adjusting anything. I try not to use any chemicals at all if I can help it. Certainly no pesticides or insecticides. No, I just thought this is wonderful. I've never really, I've heard of permaculture and I've sort of understood it, but this was a great introduction for me to see what the different principles are, how everything sort of integrates together.
Yeah.
So I'm really appreciative that that this was able to happen, and I'm looking forward to next week's talk as well.
Yeah.
And I would say one thing, and kind of wrap it up, any part of this that you integrate, if it's if it's a little bit intimidating because of the vastness of all the concept, just take any part of it that you like and try it.
Exactly.
It's gonna come out better than what the traditional way of spraying stuff to kill everything around it.
Right. No, and I like the zero waste concept and all of it. This is really intriguing. So I really appreciate it.
I think that in talking with you, Mark, just the thought of just try it is what's critically important. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, then you learn something.
Yep.
If it does work, then you got something. Then you find out that your dogs like to eat blueberries, and that's why you don't get any.
So far, I got one great ripe tomato.
All right.
And cherish it.
That's it.
Well, the others are going to take time.
Yeah. Well, we learned one thing is that we have carrots and tomatoes in separate areas. So now we have to get them together. Who knows what we'll get? So
Yeah, just don't put milkweed in the middle of your vegetables, right?
Oh, no.
all right. Well, Mark, thank you very much for the time. This has been great. So with that,
Thanks for having me.
let everybody have the rest of the evening, and we'll see you on the beach.
All right, thanks a lot. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.